Opening the center with a pawn grab creates immediate central influence and potential for a swift queenside expansion. Developing a knight towards the center prepares for pawn breaks and opens avenues for other pieces to join the fray. Seizing central territory, white immediately challenges black's knight and prepares to expand on the queenside. Embracing the fianchetto immediately, black aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and develop a formidable bishop. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces the center, aiming to prepare for kingside castling and potential pawn expansion. Challenging white's central grip with a pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt their harmonious development and seize initiative. Challenging black's central pawn structure, this capture immediately creates imbalances and opens lines for future piece activity. Reclaiming the central pawn with the knight immediately challenges white's space advantage, creating dynamic tension and offering immediate counterplay. Puncturing the center with this pawn thrust boldly claims space and challenges the knight's central dominion. Exchanging the knight immediately releases pressure, but surrenders central control and opens diagonals for white's queenside attack. Opening the b-file for your rook and queen creates immediate queenside pressure and a central pawn majority, but be mindful of the doubled c-pawns weakening your pawn structure on that side of the board, potentially becoming targets later. Developing the dark-squared bishop to g7 immediately addresses white's central pawn presence, establishing a powerful diagonal that pressures white's kingside. This fianchetto sets up a robust defensive structure and prepares for potential pawn breaks in the center or on the queenside, as black aims to equalize piece activity. Developing the bishop to a square where it targets the queenside and supports the central pawn structure creates a harmonious setup, ready to contest the d-file and exert pressure on black's potentially loose c6 pawn should it advance. Challenging the center immediately, black forcefully contests white's pawn structure and aims to open lines for their pieces, particularly the king's bishop, potentially leading to an active queenside presence. Securing the open c-file with the rook, white prepares to exert pressure on black's queenside and potentially eye weaknesses along that flank, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure against further incursions. Securing the monarch amidst the emerging central storm is paramount, bringing the king to relative safety behind a pawn shield. This maneuver aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for a potential kingside expansion, while simultaneously connecting the rooks for future action. Boldly challenging the central pawn structure, this aggressive thrust injects immediate dynamism into the position, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially open lines for counterplay. Pushing the pawn like this aggressively seizes central space, creating an immediate barrier that forces black to reevaluate their attacking potential on the queenside and potentially restricts their pieces. Unleashing the queen, qd6 aims to contest the central d5 pawn's dominance and prepare for potential pawn breaks like f5 or c4 later. It also connects the rooks, a subtle but important piece of coordination, and hints at challenging the bishop on e3, forcing white to consider its placement. This active queen maneuver simultaneously defends the queenside and offers more flexibility for piece development. Centering the bishop on d3, white aims to consolidate the pawn chain and prepare for potential queenside activity, all while keeping a watchful eye on black's central initiative. A daring thrust to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize the initiative, but it comes at the cost of potentially weakening your king's defenses. Securing the central pawn chain becomes paramount, though it somewhat restricts the bishop's diagonal. Shifting the knight to d7 opens pathways for the queen and prepares for potential kingside expansion, aiming to exploit the slightly weakened pawn structure after white's central push. Shifting the knight to the kingside, a subtle yet crucial repositioning, now aims to reinforce the central d5 pawn while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm. Observe how this knight's journey opens up lines for other pieces and creates a more cohesive defensive structure, indirectly offering prophylaxis against black's aggressive intentions. The knight's relocation to f6 seeks to bolster the central pawn structure, aiming to create a more solid pawn chain and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. Consolidating the king's safety before pressing further central advances is a prudent step, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for potential middle game skirmishes. Breaching the queenside pawn chain with this advance, black aims to disrupt white's solid central structure and potentially create an outpost for their knight on d6. This pawn thrust simultaneously challenges white's control of the d4 square and seeks to cramp white's pieces on that flank, a bold, albeit risky, gambit that could lead to a dynamic imbalance. Consolidating the bishop to the c2 square offers a subtle yet potent defensive reinforcement to the kingside, simultaneously preparing for potential pawn breaks in the center or on the queen side. A bold challenge for the center's control, fxc4 seizes the opportunity to liberate the knight and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure, even though it opens lines toward your own king. Unlocking the f file for the rook, white aims to challenge black's pawn chain and potentially exploit the open lines towards the king's vicinity. This daring pawn recapture, sacrificing temporary central control for dynamic initiative, opens up a crucial diagonal for the bishop and prepares for future pawn pushes on the queen side or a direct assault. Consider the immediate repercussions on piece activity. The knight on f6 now faces a more exposed position, and the queen might need to reposition to defend the weakened kingside. The long-term consequences of this aggressive pawn sacrifice hinge on white's ability to activate their pieces quickly and coordinate an attack before black can consolidate their material advantage. The knight's adventurous leap to g4 dramatically escalates the pawn storm's intensity, directly challenging the center's integrity and opening a potential avenue for a swift kingside assault. Clearing the critical f-file offers white a tangible advantage, forcing the black knight off its active square and potentially opening lines for further pressure down the now unobstructed column. Reclaiming the piece allows black to neutralize white's attacking momentum and secure their material balance, though it concedes the initiative and a slightly cramped position in the process. White prioritizes safety, tucking the king away from the open diagonals and potential pressure points on the kingside, a sensible prophylactic measure given the piece activity and the presence of black's fianchettoed bishop on g7, which aims at white's queenside. Exchanging the knight on e3 immediately addresses the awkward pinning situation of the black king's pawn structure, while opening lines that could become relevant for the rooks later. Reclaiming the queen on an open diagonal after the exchange, white positions the monarch's primary attacker for potential action on the kingside, while simultaneously eyeing the c4 pawn's isolated status and the lingering potential for a pawn storm advance with the f-pawn. Black seeks to activate the bishop on g7, currently a bit hemmed in by the pawn chain, and prepare for potential central pawn advances later. The rook surges to the open file, a bold assertion of dominance aiming to pry open the center further and exploit black's slightly passive bishop on d7. This proactive deployment seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queen side, potentially creating weaknesses around the c4 square. Consider the interplay. White's rook now eyes the critical 7th rank, a classic attacking outpost, while black's king remains somewhat exposed, especially with the recent pawn exchanges. The move is a strategic pivot, shifting focus from the pawn tussle to a more direct confrontation on the open central files. Observe how this relocation prepares for potential piece exchanges or further pawn advances, aiming to gain a lasting initiative. Black's initiative now spills onto the queen side, aiming to establish a stronghold with this pawn thrust. Opening up the king's diagonal for potential pressure, this maneuver aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, perhaps g3 or f3, to support the central pawns and assist in attacking black's advanced pawn chain. Confronting the knight's encroachment, this pawn push aims to contest the queenside expansion, potentially opening the file for the rook. Unlocking the king's diagonal opens up aggressive possibilities, yet repositioning the knight to the kingside squares prepares for a potential defensive posture or a future central thrust after consolidating the pawn structure. Black gambits a pawn to ignite a queenside pawn storm, aiming to shatter white's pawn structure and seize the initiative. Launching a knight forward aggressively targets the queenside weaknesses black has been cultivating, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and potentially pry open the b-file for future play. Challenging the passed pawn's momentum, black reroutes the bishop to a square where it can simultaneously eye the vulnerable white king on the h-file and potentially support future pawn advances. Pouncing on the undefended h6 square with the knight immediately disrupts black's nascent queenside expansion and simultaneously prepares to exploit any weaknesses around the black king should it remain undeveloped. Sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns is a bold gambit, but it leaves your king exposed to a devastating battery on the open diagonal. Pivoting the knight to d6 fundamentally alters the pawn structure and control of the center. It forces a reckoning with black's potentially weakened queenside majority. Now that the exchange has left black with an isolated pawn, a potential target, the focus shifts to exploiting the open lines and coordinating pieces to exploit white's slightly awkward pawn structure. Suddenly, the white rook awakens and claims its rightful, open territory, aiming to dismantle the pawn structure on the kingside while eyeing the vulnerable dark squares around the black monarch. Retreating the bishop to safety is a prudent decision, as it avoids immediate threats from the rook and opens up potential counterplay on the kingside. The bishop's new post on g4 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and possibly create future attacking chances. However, black must be mindful of the open files and white's centralized rook. Repositioning the rook to its starting file after a brief excursion, white aims to re-establish central control and potentially support a renewed assault on the queenside, acknowledging the lost initiative on the kingside. Reclaiming the bishop to the more active diagonal after its forced retreat opens up fascinating counterplay, subtly re-establishing a presence on the kingside while simultaneously preparing to harass the queen and potentially infiltrate the weakened dark squares around white's monarch. Retrieving the rook from its exposed outpost now frees up its movement and prepares to contest the contested central files. Reclaiming the contested central square with the rook immediately prepares for a dynamic pawn push on the queenside, aiming to overwhelm white's defenses and secure crucial space for black's pieces. Seeking to solidify the pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside, this move offers a subtle but important reinforcement to the kingside defense. Activating the rook on the second rank, this maneuver aggressively targets white's vulnerable c3 pawn and aims to pry open lines for potential pressure on the queenside. Unpinning the bishop and aiming for central dominance, white repositions the knight to a more active square, challenging black's consolidated pawn structure and preparing for potential knight-supported advances on the queenside. Seeking to improve piece activity and potentially create threats on the kingside, this maneuver redirects the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the vulnerable white king and potentially preparing for further pawn advances. White's knight scurries back to the king's flank, a defensive repositioning aiming to bolster the otherwise exposed monarch and potentially create mating threats later. Reclaiming the bishop's central influence offers black a chance to solidify its queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential queenside expansion, though it invites white to continue its central pawn push. Simplifying the material exchange here frees up the white rook and allows it to become a more active participant on the open file, aiming to penetrate the black position. A bold gambit to reclaim a piece, accepting the pawn structure's disarray for an immediate material goal. Reclaiming the outpost on c5, white aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and limit the mobility of the d3 bishop. This knight maneuver skillfully exploits the weakened c3 pawn and creates immediate pressure, potentially forcing a tactical response or a positional concession from black as the queenside battle intensifies. The advanced pawn becomes a critical pivot, threatening to ascend and disrupt the established pawn structure. Liberating the knight from its cramped post and initiating a tactical sequence that hinges on controlling the c-file, this capture forces a reevaluation of black's pawn structure. Black's rook now claims the open file, preparing to infiltrate white's position and create immediate threats against the disorganized pieces. Unleashing the pawn, 35. d6 immediately injects dynamism into the position, aiming to escort its companion across the board and create a decisive passed threat. Suddenly, the initiative shifts dramatically, as black's rook, now unleashed from its support duties, crashes into white's territory, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially sever the d-pawn's advance. Securing that newly opened d-file offers a potent conduit for your remaining rook, aiming to dislodge black's advanced pawn and potentially exploit its isolated position. This pawn advance suddenly offers a stark choice for white: defend the crucial 7th rank or attempt to keep the central pawn majority intact, with the latter seeming like a losing proposition given the active rook and rook pawn.